You felt it before. That strange moment when you suddenly knew something was ending. Not because anyone told you. Not because there were signs. You just knew. And weeks later, everything changed. A relationship ended. A door closed. A chapter of your life disappeared. Exactly the way you felt it would. Most people call this coincidence. But what if it isn't? What if the reason you sense certain endings and beginnings before they happen has nothing to do with predicting the future, and everything to do with recognizing what God has already set in motion? Because long before a sunrise appears, the sky changes first. Most people are asleep during this part. They wake up when the sun is already high, already obvious, already impossible to miss. But some people are awake earlier, not because they have special powers, not because they can predict when the sun will rise. They simply learn to notice the sky changing before the sun arrives. This is exactly how God moves. Long before anything visible happens in your life, something invisible has already begun. A shift in the spiritual atmosphere around you. A change in the air, so to speak, before the actual event ever appears. And some people, the spiritually sensitive ones, start to feel that shift before anyone else does. Have you ever felt a season of your life quietly ending, long before the actual ending arrived? Maybe a job that hadn't changed yet, but something in you already knew it was about to. Maybe a relationship that looked fine on the outside, but inside you, something had already started to let go. Maybe a city, a routine, a chapter of your identity, and you felt the closing before a single outward thing confirmed it. Or maybe it went the other way. Maybe you felt a stirring of something new, long before any opportunity showed up. A restlessness that wasn't anxiety, but anticipation. A sense that you were being prepared for something, even though nothing on the calendar suggested it yet. That's not your imagination working overtime. That's you noticing the sky change before the sunrise. Here's something important, though, and I want you to really sit with this. You didn't predict the sunrise. Let that sink in. You didn't create that shift. You didn't cause the season to end or the new one to begin. You simply noticed the light before others looked up. This distinction matters more than you might think, because there's a temptation when you start noticing these things to feel special, to feel like you have some kind of gift that sets you apart from everyone else. And honestly, that's where a lot of people get this wrong. Being spiritually sensitive isn't about being chosen for some elite status. It's not about superiority. It's about attentiveness. It's the difference between someone who is always rushing through their morning with their head down and someone who happens to glance up at the sky and notice it's already starting to glow at the edges. Both people will eventually see the sunrise, but only one of them noticed it was coming. And here's the deeper truth underneath all of this. God doesn't usually announce his movements with fireworks. He doesn't typically begin with the dramatic, visible, undeniable moment. That comes later. What comes first is quiet, subtle, almost easy to miss if you're not paying attention. A change in how you feel about something before circumstances around it actually shift. A sense of completion before the actual ending takes place. A flicker of anticipation before the door even appears, let alone opens. This is the language God often speaks in first. Not loud declarations, but quiet shifts in the atmosphere of your spirit. And if you've ever felt like you knew something was coming before it came, in a way you couldn't fully explain to others, this might be why. It's not because you're special in some way that separates you from everyone else. It's because somewhere along the way, whether you realized it or not, you started paying attention to the sky. You started noticing the colors shift before the obvious thing arrived. So if you've ever doubted these feelings, ever wondered if you were imagining things, ever felt strange for sensing an ending, or a beginning before it became visible to anyone else, I want you to consider something. What if the reason you feel things early isn't because you know more than others? What if it's not about knowledge at all? What if it's simply because you've learned to listen differently? Have you ever noticed how animals seem to know a storm is coming long before the first drop of rain falls or the first clap of thunder sounds? Birds change direction in the sky. Dogs grow restless and pace near the door. Cattle huddle together in the field. The whole rhythm of nature shifts, sometimes hours before the storm actually arrives. Nobody trained these animals to do this. Nobody taught them how to read weather patterns or interpret pressure systems. They simply respond to something happening around them. A change in air pressure. A shift in the wind. Something most of us would never notice, because we're not tuned to that frequency. And here's the important part. The bird isn't predicting the storm. The bird isn't some mystical creature with the power to see into the future. The bird is responding to a signal that's already present, a signal most creatures simply don't have the sensitivity to detect. I think a lot of spiritually sensitive people experience something similar, except instead of sensing weather, they're sensing shifts in the people and circumstances around them. Have you ever just known that someone was about to walk out of your life long before they actually left? Maybe nothing had changed on the surface. The conversations were still happening. The relationships still looked the same to everyone else. But inside you, something had already registered a shift. A quiet knowing that this person's season in your life was coming to a close. Or maybe it's gone the other way. Maybe you felt a stirring about someone before you even met them. A sense that someone significant was about to enter your life, weeks or months before they actually showed up. Not because you can see the future, but because something had already shifted in the spiritual atmosphere around you, and you picked up on it. This happens with opportunities too. Sometimes people feel a sense of expectancy, a kind of internal something is about to happen feeling, long before any actual opportunity presents itself. They can't point to anything concrete. There's no evidence yet. But there's a feeling, a stirring, almost like the air itself has changed. And then there are the dreams, the nudges, the impressions that seem to arrive out of nowhere, often right before something significant takes place. A dream about a person you haven't spoken to in years, and then they reach out the next day. A sudden, unexplainable urge to pray for someone, only to find out later they were going through something difficult at that exact moment. A feeling that you needed to prepare for something, even though nothing in your circumstances suggested any change was coming. None of this means you're predicting events. It means you're responding to movements that have already begun. Movements happening in the unseen realm before they ever become visible in the physical one. But I want to pause here and say something important, because this is where things can easily go wrong. Sensitivity is not superiority. If you've experienced these kinds of moments, it can be tempting to feel like you're somehow more spiritual than others, more connected, more tuned in. And honestly, that mindset can quietly poison the gift you've been given. Think about the bird again. The bird that senses the storm isn't better than the other birds. It's not more valuable, more important, more chosen. It's simply responding to something it's been designed to notice. And honestly, every bird probably has this capacity. Some are just more attentive than others in any given moment. The same is true spiritually. This kind of awareness isn't reserved for a select few special people. It's something woven into how God designed us to relate to Him, to be sensitive to His movements, His promptings, the subtle shifts He brings about before the visible changes arrive. If you've experienced this kind of early knowing, it's not because you're more important than someone who hasn't. It's simply because, in that moment, you were paying attention to something most people walk right past. And here's something worth sitting with. This sensitivity isn't always comfortable. Sometimes it means feeling the weight of an ending before you're ready for it. Sometimes it means sensing a change before you understand what it means, or what you're supposed to do with that feeling. Sometimes it means carrying a quiet knowing that you can't fully explain, and don't know how to share with the people around you. This is the part nobody really prepares you for, because there's a side to this kind of awareness that can become genuinely difficult to navigate. A side where the lines between sensing something real and simply feeling afraid can start to blur. Where the quiet knowing can get tangled up with anxiety, with worry, with a racing mind that convinces you something is wrong long before you actually have any reason to believe that. And if you've ever struggled to tell the difference between a genuine spiritual impression and simple fear dressed up to look like intuition, you're not alone. This is one of the most important distinctions anyone walking this path needs to learn, because there is a danger hidden inside spiritual sensitivity that many people never learn to recognize. Here's something that trips up almost everyone who walks this path at some point. Confusing anxiety with spiritual awareness. Because, on the surface, they can feel deceptively similar. Both involve a sense that something is coming. Both can create a feeling of unease, of anticipation, of something is about to happen. And if you've never learned to tell them apart, you can spend years mistaking one for the other, reacting to fear as though it were a divine signal, or worse, dismissing genuine spiritual recognition because it felt too quiet to take seriously. So, let's slow down here, because this distinction matters more than almost anything else we'll talk about. Fear is loud. It's urgent. It demands your attention right now, and it rarely lets you think clearly. Fear tends to spiral. One worry leads to another, which leads to another, until your mind is racing through a dozen different worst-case scenarios, none of which have actually happened. Fear is chaotic. It doesn't point you toward one clear thing. It scatters your attention across endless possibilities, most of which never come true. Divine recognition feels almost the opposite in every way. It's quiet. It's precise. It doesn't flood your mind with 100 different fears. It settles on one specific thing, one impression, one sense of knowing. And it does so with a strange kind of calm. Think of it like this. Fear is static, that crackling noise on an old radio when you're between stations, loud and directionless and impossible to make sense of. Divine recognition is the signal, the actual station coming through clearly once the static fades. Fear is the sound of waves crashing violently against rocks. Overwhelming, relentless, drowning out everything else. Divine recognition is more like a whisper, something so quiet you'd miss it entirely if you weren't paying attention, and yet somehow it's the only thing you can actually hear clearly. This is one of the most overlooked truths about how God communicates. We tend to assume that if something is truly important, truly from God, it would come with intensity, with urgency, feeling that demands immediate action. But over and over, what we find is that God tends to move in peace, not panic. The quiet, settled knowing is often the more reliable signal, while the loud, urgent, anxious feeling is often just fear wearing a spiritual costume. So, how do you actually tell the difference in real life, in the moment? Start with this question. Does this feeling create chaos in my mind? Or does it create clarity? Fear tends to generate more questions than answers. It makes you spin through possibilities. What if this happens? What if that happens? What does this mean? What should I do? It rarely settles. It rarely gives you a clear sense of direction. It just keeps expanding. Divine recognition tends to do the opposite. Even if you don't fully understand it yet, even if you can't explain exactly what it means, it tends to bring a strange sense of settledness along with it. You might not know what's coming, but you have a quiet confidence that whatever it is, it's not something to be afraid of. There's a peace underneath it, even if the situation itself is uncertain. Let's look at some real, ordinary examples of what this looks like. Sometimes people feel a quiet sense that a chapter of their life is ending. Not in a panicked, everything is falling apart kind of way, but in a calm, almost gentle way. A sense of completion. A feeling that something has run its course, and it's time to let it go. That's very different from the anxious thought. What if I lose everything? Which spirals and grows and refuses to settle. Sometimes people feel a quiet, prompting to reach out to someone. Not an anxious, something terrible must be happening to them thought, but a simple, calm impression. Call this person, check in with them, send that message. Often, it turns out the timing was significant. The person needed to hear from them right at that moment. But the prompting itself didn't come wrapped in fear. It came wrapped in peace. And sometimes, people feel a quiet pull to change direction, even when nothing on the surface suggests they should. Not a panicked, everything is wrong, I need to escape feeling, but a settled sense that a different path is opening up, and it's time to start moving that way. In each of these examples, the feeling itself was calm, focused, specific. It didn't demand an immediate, frantic response. It simply offered a quiet invitation to pay attention, to notice, to consider. This is what divine recognition tends to feel like. Fear screams. God whispers. And here's why this distinction matters so much. If you can't tell the difference, you'll either start treating every anxious thought as though it's a message from God, which will exhaust you and lead you down paths that were never meant for you. Or you'll start dismissing every quiet impression, because it doesn't feel dramatic enough to be real, and you'll miss the very things you were designed to notice. Learning to recognize the difference between the static and the signal, between the waves crashing and the whisper underneath them, is one of the most important spiritual skills you can develop. It's not about becoming more anxious or more vigilant. It's actually about becoming more still, more attuned to the quiet, because that's where the real signal tends to come through. But here's something that might surprise you. Even when people learn to recognize this quiet, calm, divine recognition within themselves, even when they sense something real and significant before it happens, there's often a problem waiting on the other side. Because if God truly moves quietly, if his signals really do tend to come as whispers rather than shouts, why is it that so many people, including the people closest to us, dismiss these signs the moment we try to share them? Have you ever stood near train tracks and felt the ground begin to vibrate before you could see or hear the train itself? There's a strange sensation that happens, a subtle hum beneath your feet, a faint trembling in the rails. And if you're standing close enough, paying attention, you feel it before there's any visible sign that a train is coming at all. But here's the thing. Someone standing a little further away wouldn't feel anything. To them, everything seems completely normal. No train, no sound, no reason to expect anything. And if you turned to them and said, "A train is coming," they'd probably look at you a little strangely, because from where they're standing, there's no evidence for that claim. Nothing to confirm it. Just your word. This is exactly what it's like to sense something spiritually before it becomes visible to everyone else. You feel the vibration. You sense the shift. Something in you knows that change is approaching, that a situation is about to unfold, that something is already in motion even though nothing on the surface has changed yet. But when you try to share this with the people around you, you're often met with confusion, skepticism, or outright dismissal. And it makes sense, doesn't it? From their perspective, there's nothing to see. No evidence. Just a feeling you're describing. Something you can't fully explain. Something that sounds vague or uncertain when you try to put it into words. This is one of the hardest parts of spiritual sensitivity. It's not that people are wrong to question what they can't perceive themselves. It's that the timing of recognition and the timing of evidence rarely line up. You feel the shift first. The proof comes later, sometimes much later. And in that gap, in that space between sensing something and seeing it confirmed, doubt creeps in. Not just from others, but often from yourself too. Maybe you've had moments where you felt strongly that something was about to change, a relationship, a job situation, a direction in your life, and you tried to explain it to someone close to you. And they looked at you like you were overreacting, like you were imagining things, like there was nothing there. Maybe you even started to doubt yourself in those moments. Maybe you thought, perhaps I'm wrong. Perhaps I'm wrong. Perhaps I'm just being paranoid, or hopeful, or anxious. And maybe you let that feeling go, dismissed it the way everyone else seemed to be dismissing it. And then, weeks or months later, it happened. The thing you sensed actually came to pass. The shift you felt finally became visible to everyone, not just you. This is such a common experience for spiritually sensitive people, and it's worth pausing on, because there's something important happening in this gap between sensing and seeing. The train was already moving. It was always moving, long before anyone standing further away could feel it. The vibration in the tracks wasn't a false signal. It was real information about something that was already underway. The evidence simply hadn't arrived yet for everyone else to perceive it. You weren't wrong when you sensed it. You were early, and there's something both validating and humbling about what often comes next. Sometimes, after the situation unfolds, after the change becomes visible, people come back to you. The same people who doubted what you said, who looked at you strangely, who dismissed your feeling as overthinking, they come back and say something different now. You were right. I should have listened to you. These moments can feel like vindication. Like finally, someone understands what you were sensing all along. And there's nothing wrong with feeling relief in those moments, especially after carrying something alone for so long, something you couldn't fully explain or prove. But I want to gently challenge something here. Because if the only value you find in these moments is being right, if the primary feeling is finally, someone believes me, there's a risk of missing something much deeper. Because being right isn't really the point. It never was. The greatest purpose of these moments, the times when you sense something before others do, when you feel a shift before any evidence exists, when you carry a quiet knowing that others can't yet perceive, has very little to do with whether you turn out to be correct. There's something far more significant happening underneath all of this. Something that has nothing to do with prediction, validation, or being proven right in the end. And once you understand what that something actually is, it changes everything about how you relate to these moments of early recognition. So if it's not about being right, and it's not about prediction, and it's not about being special, or chosen, or somehow above everyone else, then what is the actual purpose of all this? Why does God allow some people to sense things before they happen? Why does He let you feel the shift in the sky before the sun rises, the vibration in the tracks before the train arrives, the quiet whisper before the visible answer comes? The answer is simpler than you might expect, and yet it's also the most profound thing we've talked about so far. It's about trust. It's about relationship. Think about a gardener. Long before any flowers bloom, long before there's anything beautiful to look at, the gardener is already at work, preparing the soil, planting the seeds, watering ground that, to anyone walking by, looks completely empty. There's nothing visible yet. No color, no bloom, no evidence of anything happening at all. But the gardener knows. The gardener doesn't need to see the flowers yet to know they're coming, because the gardener is the one who planted them. The gardener was there for the part nobody else saw. Now imagine someone walks by during this time. Someone who happens to glance at that empty patch of soil and feels, somehow, that something is about to grow there. They can't see it yet. There's no proof. But they sense it, this quiet knowing that something is happening beneath the surface, something that will eventually become visible to everyone. That person isn't predicting the future. They're recognizing the gardener's work. This is what's actually happening when you sense something before it manifests. You're not seeing ahead of time what's going to happen. You're recognizing that God, the gardener, has already begun working. The seeds are already planted. The soil is already being prepared. And somehow, in a way that's hard to fully explain, you're being given a glimpse of that unseen work. Think about an architect designing the foundation of a building long before the structure itself begins to rise. To someone passing by, all they might see is an empty lot, maybe some markings on the ground, nothing that looks like anything yet. But the architect already knows what's coming, because the planning, the foundation, the unseen structural work, that's already underway. The building exists in the architect's mind and in the groundwork long before it exists in the skyline. Or think about an author writing chapters of a story long before the reader ever turns to that page. The events of chapter 10 are already written, already determined, long before the reader, still on chapter 3, has any idea what's coming. The reader can't see chapter 10 yet, but it already exists. It's already been written. This is the relationship between you and God's timing. He is the gardener, the architect, the author. He is always working ahead of what's visible, always preparing, always laying groundwork long before the outcome becomes apparent to anyone, including you. And sometimes, in His kindness, He lets you catch a glimpse of that work. Not so you can predict what's coming with certainty, not so you can feel ahead of everyone else, but so you can learn to trust Him more deeply. Because here's the thing about trust. Trust isn't really tested when everything is visible, when the flowers have already bloomed, when the building is already standing, when you're already on the chapter you were waiting for. Trust is tested in the waiting, in the in-between, in the space where you've sensed that something is happening, but you can't see it yet, and you don't know exactly when it will become visible. Every time you've felt that quiet shift, that early knowing, that sense that something is already in motion before any evidence exists, you've been given an invitation. An invitation to trust the gardener even when you can't see the flowers. To trust the architect even when all you can see is an empty lot. To trust the author even though you're still on an earlier page of the story. And this is the heart of everything we've explored. You do not see the future. You recognize what heaven has already set in motion. This isn't about prediction. It never was. It's about relationship. It's about being someone who has learned to notice the gardener's hands at work in the soil, even before anything has broken through the surface. It's about being someone who feels the vibration in the tracks and chooses to trust that the train, God's plan, His timing, His purposes, is already moving, even when nobody else can feel it yet. And here is the final realization, the one that changes everything once you truly let it sink in. God was moving before you noticed. God was working before you understood. God was preparing before you ever arrived at the moment you're standing in right now. The greatest miracle in all of this isn't that you sensed something before others did. It isn't that you were early, or attentive, or sensitive in a way that set you apart. The greatest miracle is realizing that heaven was already working on your behalf long before you ever felt the first whisper of it. Before the sky started to change, before the ground began to vibrate, before you noticed anything at all. He was already there, already working, already preparing the way. You were simply invited to notice. If something in this video resonated with you, if you've ever felt something shift before it became visible, before anyone else could see it, I want you to comment below. I noticed the movement, because the sign was never the destination. The sign is proof that God is already moving,